Hello and welcome back to the Toolbox project. In this video, it's a big one, we're getting this thing glued together. Let's get going. Right, so I do want to just prepare you for this part before we get stuck into it, because gluing up is a big part of any project, but this one especially because there are a few things that differ with this. Firstly, every single component we have been working on thus far is going into this glue up, which is something that isn't the case with every project. Secondly, if something starts going wrong throughout this glue up and we find out we need to abort it, good luck to you. As I've discussed previously, once this thing goes together, there is no taking it apart. So if you accidentally put the lid in the bottom groove rather than the top groove or vice versa, you're going to have to live with it, unfortunately. The way this thing is assembled makes it almost impossible to disassemble once it's together. Not only that, but we're also going to have the extra tightness imparted by the glue on the joints. So what I'm saying is, you need to be as prepared as possible for this step. And we're going to be doing extra steps before the glue up, such as masking off the internal faces, making gluing blocks to ensure that every joint is pressed individually. And of course, just to reiterate, make sure you have assembled this thing to ensure it goes together correctly, but only assemble it with the lid in place or the bottom in place. Do not do it with them all together, or else you'll have the same problem that I've just described. Anyway, right, I've gone on enough. Let's get started with this. So in the last episode, we got all the internal faces sanded and waxed so that glue doesn't stick to them. But we're going to take that a step further and mask off this internal face as well, because there is not a chance we are getting any of this glue off while it's wet. The wax will certainly help this, but why not give ourselves some extra backups just in case? So I'm personally using low tack masking tape for this, but there's a variety of things you can use. Just make sure it's not going to leave a gummy mess on the material after you peel it away. This stuff is my favourite for doing it. It's a little bit on the expensive side, but it works very well. So I'll link it below if you're interested. Just make sure to go around afterwards and remove all the excess that is overhanging the grooves. You don't want that interfering with things. Right, so next we move on to the gluing blocks, and with these we're going to cut a series of prongs on them that push exactly on the areas that we want them to with the tails and also on the pins as well. That means for this you're going to need 8 blocks, and these need to be the exact height of the toolbox. They could be a little bit longer, but it's better if they're exactly the same length. And they also need to be quite substantial in width and thickness. It's very important that you don't make these out of something mushy like MDF or some sort of softwood. These are made of ash, they're really rigid, and they're not going to start bowing and mushing under the weight of the clamps. And so with these, in terms of the thickness and width, they're just over the height of the tails. That's not too important. As long as they're pretty substantial, that's all you're looking for. And so to make these prongs, we're going to do as follows. You're going to place it next to the corner that you want to create a gluing block for. In this case, it's 3 and it's the tails. So we'll put 3 and then a T on there. That way I can make it bespoke fit what I've got here. Then we're going to put it on the tails, but we're going to push it towards the baseline. Once you've done that, you're going to put a little line about 1 millimeter either side of the area for the pins. So I'm drawing this just slightly over the tails at the moment. Then obviously when you do this, make sure it is flush on the top and bottom as well. You're then going to flip that upright, and in these areas where the pins are going to be, just scribble them like this. That is the area we're going to start removing, and the depth in which we remove is dictated by how much the pins stick proud of the tails. In this case, we made them absolutely flush, so this depth only needs to be about 1 millimeter or so, just to give ourselves a little bit of wiggle room, but it doesn't need to be anything like up here. That is just utterly pointless. And we're going to do exactly the same on the pins. So firstly, 4 and P, get it flush on the top and bottom, and then mark out those areas where the pins are, but draw about 1 millimeter over as well. So that is going to leave you with some very thin sections, but don't worry, there'll be plenty of strength in it. Once you've done that, flip it upright and then scribble out those areas you're going to be removing. And to explain why we're doing this is somewhat tricky to explain, but it is something I did in the previous series while we were making the Dovetail Box project. And so if you want to know the reason why we need to make these gluing blocks and why we're having to cut out these prongs, then there is an explanation in that video that I'll link below. So next we're going to take those blocks to the bandsaw and start clearing out the waste that we've scribbled out. Of course, on these ones for the pins, that's quite a lot to remove between each of those areas. I would suggest doing a series of cuts a few millimeters apart and then chisel out the waste afterwards. That's personally how I'm going to do it. Right, so quick checklist. Inside face is finished, corners masked off, gluing blocks made. Now all we've got to do is glue it together. So before slapping the first layer of glue on this, let's make sure that we've got the clamps ready. They're on the wall there. Obviously I can't do a proper dry fit with this because we can't put the whole thing together at once, but I know that I've got at least 8 clamps there ready to go. And then secondly, let's get everything laid out so that it all makes sense and we're not going to be hunting around for components or accidentally put them on the wrong way. So that's going to be the front of the box, down like that, with the inside facing up. You're then going to get the lid. Hopefully you've decided what the front is by now. I've got a face side and face edge, so I know that it's going to be going in like this. Let's fold that down like that. The tongue and groove base, get that all pushed together and pre-assembled so that we're not going to be messing around with this. Once you're happy with that, get them all even and put that aside. We'll grab that in a minute. As for the sides, make sure your corners match up. So that's 1 and 1. This one, 2 and 2. Double check that. Yep, that lines up. That lines up. Cool, so lid's going to go in, sides are going to go in, and then we need to be able to put this on top. And so 3 is there. Let's see, 3 is also there. So that's cool, that's going on that way. Let's put this aside using that same orientation. And then you might also be able to see I've got all of my blocks paired up here as well. So normally I would temporarily attach these blocks to the components before putting the glue on, using a technique I shared in the Dovetail Box project using a mixture of masking tape and super glue. It's a great way of temporarily attaching them without ripping out any grain when you remove them. So I would strongly advise using that technique. The video is listed below. However, saying that, I've just realized I haven't actually got any super glue. So my method is going to be to assemble this entire thing with glue on it, get all those joints bottomed out as much as I can with the mallet, and then tape these blocks on just using parcel tape or something up there to hold them in place while I get the clamps on. It's not the best way of doing things because it is just another step while that glue is applied. Preferably we would get these attached beforehand, but we'll get through it, it'll be all right. And I just wanted to quickly cover where we're going to be applying this glue before I actually start doing it, because I'm going to struggle to talk you through it while I'm doing it. We're going to put it in the bottom of the sockets, up the walls of each side of the sockets, on each of the miters, up the walls of the miters here. And I also do a small bit on the back of the pins here as well, because that will get a little bit of glue in the bottom of the tails. Don't feel the need to do both parts of the joints, just doing the pins is absolutely fine. Right, let's go for it. So as soon as you get that first corner in, get the top and bottom fitted now so you don't forget to do it. And of course, double check that you have actually put the top at the top of the box where that larger dovetail is and you haven't accidentally done it upside down. You also want to take this opportunity to re-centralize the lid in the groove, because inevitably there will be some sort of glue squeeze out on the outside that may hold this lid in position. And so if you just get one of your gluing blocks or another piece of wood or something like that, put it into the groove, angle it up to match that chamfer that we've planed on the top, and just give it a few taps and you'll see it will soon centralize. Of course, this will move over time, so don't worry about it too much, but you know, get it in the ballpark. And you can, of course, do the same for the tongue and groove base. I don't tend to worry about this too much. Okay, start getting the blocks attached. Right, and of course, before you do anything else, check it for square. Just just do the final bit of re-centralizing on that top panel. Right, so I left this toolbox in the clamps overnight. I've just taken them off. Let's take a closer look. So the miters have all closed up beautifully, a few small steps in places, which is to be expected. The joints themselves are looking pretty good. Most of the dark lines you see here are pen marks, but there are a few small hairline gaps that I'll show you how to fix in the next lesson. And interestingly, even though we set the marking gauge to ensure these tails were assembled completely flush, there is still small amounts of end grain sticking proud on each of these. And so this is the advantage of these gluing blocks we made in this episode, because they really mush those tails into the bottom of the sockets, as well as the pins to the bottom of the tails, to ensure that there is no gaps along that baseline that should be there. In fact, they work so well that they actually push it slightly beyond what we set the marking gauge to be. And in this case, we can actually use that excess end grain to close some of the gaps, and I'll show you that in the next episode. Before we finish, however, let's quickly take a look at the base. I showed you previously that I sized this slightly wrong, and so we'll take a better look at it now. So yeah, fortunately none of them glued themselves in place. They're all still loose, which is exactly what we want. We want to allow these to move with the seasons, but we have got that problem when you push them apart. There is a small gap between them, and the reason for that is because the tongue and groove is only 5mm deep, whereas we've accounted for 8mm of movement with this. And so while you'll still be able to pull these apart like this with that 8mm of movement, you won't be able to pull it apart far enough to expose a gap between the tongue and groove, which is why I recommended doing about 10mm deep in terms of depth. And of course on the end we've got the slightly exposed joinery, which isn't the end of the world. I don't actually mind it that much, but is certainly worth considering if you're going to be making this. The reason this is overlooked is because simply this is a prototype for a new design I'm working on. I wanted to have a little bit more purchase under the box to pick it up, because doing so without any hardware on the side is quite difficult, but as a result, that's happened. But I wanted to share my findings with you if you happen to be designing this box yourself. And of course, as I mentioned, the plans for this project have all taken this into account. And if you're following those, you won't face any of the issues that I faced throughout this. So as always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do not forget to press the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next lesson where we're going to start flushing this off and removing that lid. I'll see you then.